There age-long she had dwelt, an evil thing in spider form, even such as once of old had lived in the land of the elves in the west that is now under the sea. How Shelob came there, flying from ruin, no tale tells, for out of the dark years few tales have come. But still, she was there, who was there before Sauron and before the first stone of Barad-dûr, and she served none but herself. Bloated and grown fat with endless brooding of her feasts, weaving webs of shadow, for all living things were her food. Far and wide her lesser broods, bastards of the miserable mates, her own offspring, spread from glen to glen, from the Ephel Duath to the eastern hills, to Dol Guldur and the fastnesses of Mirkwood. But none could rival her, Shelob the Great, last child of Ungoliant to trouble the unhappy world. Today, September 22nd, is Hobbit Day. It's Frodo and Bilbo's birthdays, and a reminder of the simple heroism of hobbits. In celebration of that, a bunch of us Tolkien-related YouTubers have gotten together to create a playlist of some of our favourite moments from Tolkien's works. The link to that is down below, and I really encourage you to go check it out. Here today on the channel, though, we'll be talking about one of the great tales of Hobbit heroism. It's when Samwise Gamgee, the true hero of Lord of the Rings, took on Shelob. And I want to say that this video in particular was made possible by my patrons. Their support meant that I could hire an artist that I really enjoy working with to put this together. Thank you so much, Carolina, and thank you to all of you. You guys are amazing. Links, if you want to join the community, are down below. Frodo was lying on the ground, and the monster was bending over him, so intent upon her victim that she took no heed of Sam and his cries, until he was close at hand. She was the most loathly shape he had ever beheld, horrible beyond the horror of an evil dream. Most like a spider she was, but huger than the great hunting beasts, and more terrible than they because of the evil purpose in her remorseless eyes, clustering in her out-thrust head. Great horns she had, and behind her stalk-like neck was a huge swollen body, a vast bloated bag, swaying and sagging between her legs. Its great bulk was black, blotched with livid marks, but the belly underneath was pale and luminous and gave forth a stench. Her legs were bent with great knobbed joints above her back, and hairs that stuck out like steel spines, and at each leg's end there was a claw. As Sam rushed up, he saw that Frodo was already bound in cords, wound about him from ankle to shoulder. On the near side of him lay, gleaming on the ground, his elven blade, where it had fallen useless from his grasp. Sam did not wait to wonder what was to be done, or whether he was brave or loyal or filled with rage. He sprang forward with a yell and seized his master's sword in his left hand. Then he charged. No onslaught more fierce was ever seen in the savage world of beasts, where some desperate small creature armed with little teeth alone will spring upon a tower of horn and hide that stands above its fallen mate. Disturbed, as if out of some gloating dream by his small yell, she turned slowly, the dreadful malice of her glance upon him. But almost before she was aware that a fury was upon her greater than any she had known in countless years, the shining sword bit upon her foot and shore away the claw. Sam sprang in, inside the arches of her legs, and with a quick upthrust of his other hand, stabbed at the clustered eyes upon her lowered head. One great eye went dark. Now the miserable creature was right under her, for the moment out of her reach of her sting and her claws. Her vast belly was above him with its putrid light, and the stench of it almost smote him down. Still, his fury held for one more blow, and before she could sink upon him, smothering him in all his little impudence of courage, he slashed the bright elven blade across her with desperate strength. But Shelob was not as dragons are. No softer spot she had save only her eyes. Knobbed and pitted with corruption was her age-old hide, but ever thickened within layer and layer of evil growth. The blade scored it with a dreadful gash, but those hideous folds could not be pierced by any strength of men. Poison frothed and bubbled from the wound. Now splaying her legs, she drove her huge bulk down on him again. Too soon. for Sam still stood upon his feet, and dropping his own sword with both hands, he held the elven blade point upwards, fending off that ghastly roof. And so Shelob, with the driving force of her own cruel will, with a strength greater than any warrior's hand, thrust herself upon a bitter spike. Deep it pricked, as Sam was crushed slowly to the ground. No such anguish had Shelob ever known, or dreamed of knowing in all her long world of wickedness. Heaving up again, wrenching away from the pain, she bent her writhing limbs between her and sprang backwards in a convulsive leap. Sam had fallen to his knees at Frodo's head, his senses reeling in the foul stench, his two hands still gripping the hilt of the sword. Slowly, he raised his head and saw her, only a few paces away, eyeing him, her beak drabbling a spittle of venom, and a green ooze trickling from below her wounded eye. There she crouched, her shuddering belly splayed open on the ground, the great bows of her legs quivering, as she gathered herself for another spring, this time to crush and to sting to death. No little bite of poison to still the struggling of her meat, this time to slay and then to rend. Then, as if some remote voice had spoken, he fumbled in his breast with his left hand and found what he sought. Cold and hard and solid it seemed to his touch in a phantom world of horror. The phial of Galadriel. "Galadriel," he said faintly, and then he heard voices far off but clear, the crying of the elves as they walked under the stars in his beloved shadows of the Shire. "Gilthoniel al-Albreth!" And then his tongue was loosed and his voice cried in a language which he did not know. "Albeth Githoniel, o Manal Palandiriel, Lenaron si Denurthos, Atironin Fanualos." And with that, he staggered to his feet and he was Samwise the Hobbit, Hamfar's son again. As if his indomitable spirit had set its potency in motion, the glass blazed suddenly like a white torch in his hand. It flamed like a star that, leaping from the firmament, sears the dark air with intolerable light. No such terror out of heaven had ever burned in Shelob's face before. The beams of it entered her wounded head and scored it with an unbearable pain, and the dreadful infection of light spread from eye to eye. She fell back, beating the air with her forelegs, her sight blasted by inner lightings, her mind in agony. Then turning her maimed head away, she rolled aside and began to crawl, claw by claw, towards the opening in the dark cliff behind. Sam came on. He was reeling like a drunken man, but he came on, and Shelob cowed at last, shrunken in defeat, jerked and quivered as she tried to hasten from him. She reached the hole, and squeezing down, leaving a trail of green-yellow slime, she slipped in, even as Sam hewed a last stroke at her dragging legs. Then he fell to the ground. Shelob was gone. Sam was left alone. "Frodo, Mr. Frodo," he called. "Don't leave me here alone. It's your Sam calling. Don't go where I can't follow. Wake up, Mr. Frodo. Oh, wake up, Frodo, my dear, wake up." And then black despair came down on him, and Sam bowed his head and drew his grey hood over his head, and night came into his heart, and he knew no more. When at last the blankness passed, Sam looked up and shadows were about him, but for how many minutes or hours the world had gone dragging on, he could not tell. He was still in the same place, and his master still lay beside him dead. The mountains had not crumbled, nor had the earth fallen into ruin. "What shall I do? What shall I do?" he said. "Did I come all this way for nothing?" And then he remembered his own voice speaking words that at a time he did not understand himself, at the beginning of their journey. "I have something to do before the end. I must see it through, sir, if you understand." But he could not go on, not yet. He knelt and held Frodo's hand and could not release it. And time went by and still he knelt, holding his master's hand, and in his heart keeping a debate. He stooped. Very gently he undid the clasp at the neck and slipped his hand inside Frodo's tunic. Then with his other hand, raising the head, he kissed the cold forehead and softly drew the chain over it. And then the head lay quietly back again in rest. No change came over the still face, and by that, more than by all the other tokens, Sam was convinced at last that Frodo had died, and had laid aside the quest.